The night Frederick Hadley collapsed through the barn door, Harriet Shelton was already on her feet with a shotgun in her hands, because in the Kansas Territory in the autumn of 1873, a woman alone on 40 acres learned to sleep with one ear pressed to the dark. She had heard the sound first, not a knock, not a voice calling out for help, but a heavy, wet thud against the old barn door, like something had thrown itself against the weathered wood and used up every last scrap of life it possessed in doing so. The lantern on her nightstand had been lit before her eyes were fully open, and the shotgun was in her grip before her feet found the floorboards. She crossed the yard between the house and barn in bare feet, the October grass cold and damp against her skin, the stars above the flat Kansas plain burning like scattered embers in a wide black sky. She shouldered the barn door open with the gun leveled and found him. He was face down in the straw just inside the threshold, one arm stretched out before him as though he had been reaching for something that kept moving away. His coat was dark with dried blood across the left side, and when Harriet brought the lantern down close to him, she could see that the blood was not entirely dried. There was fresh dampness at the edge of a wound high on his ribs, and his breathing was shallow and ragged and wrong. A horse stood in the stall at the far end of the barn, a big roan gelding that watched her with wide, exhausted eyes, still saddled, still bridled, foam dried white along its neck. Harriet looked at the man for 3 long seconds. She considered in a very practical way all the things he might be: an outlaw, a thief, a man who had gotten what he deserved out on the open road and had brought his trouble to her door. She was a widow of 31 years, 5 years removed from a husband who had left her this farm, and a debt that was nearly paid and not much else, and she had learned to be practical about nearly everything. Then he made a sound, not a word, not a cry, just a low, broken sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest, the kind of sound a person made when they were losing the argument with their own body, and Harriet Shelton set the shotgun against the wall and knelt down in the straw beside him. She turned him over carefully. His face was the first thing she truly saw of him. He was perhaps 34 or 35, dark-haired and unshaved, with a jaw that was sharp beneath several days of rough beard. There was a long scar that ran from just below his left eye down across his cheekbone toward his jaw, pale and old and healed, the kind of scar that had been given to him years ago and that he had carried long enough that it had simply become part of him. His eyes were closed, but she could see them moving beneath the lids, restless and fevered. She did what needed doing. She did it efficiently and without drama, because that was how Harriet did most things. She got old Caleb Morse's boy, who was 16 and lived a half-mile down the road, to come sit with the horses in the morning. She dragged Frederick, she did not know his name yet, would not know it until the following afternoon, into the barn's small side room where she stored feed in winter and where a cot had sat unused for 2 years. She cut his coat and shirt away from the wound with the kitchen scissors and found that he had been shot, a clean enough wound but badly tended, infected and angry, the flesh around it swollen and hot to the touch. She had seen gunshot wounds before. Her husband Thomas had taken a stray round in the shoulder during a dispute between neighboring cattlemen 6 years back, and the doctor from Millhaven, 12 miles east, had talked her through the cleaning and the dressing of it. The doctor from Millhaven was named Curtis Pratt. He was a good man and a competent one, and she had sent the Morse boy for him at first light. While she waited, she boiled water and cleaned the wound as best she could, and packed it with clean cloth and pressed her hand flat against the stranger's forehead. He was burning. His lips were cracked and dry, and he was muttering things she could not make out: names, maybe, or places, or just the fractured language of a fevered dream. She poured water carefully between his lips, and some of it went down, and some of it ran down his chin, and she wiped his chin with the hem of her apron. She noticed, in those early hours before the doctor came, the other scars, not just the one on his face. There were old scars across his hands, and a long one along his right forearm that had the particular shape of a knife wound. There were scars that told a story about a life that had been hard and long and conducted mostly in the open, away from soft things. There were no scars on his back from a lash, and she was glad of that, because she would not have been able to bear seeing it, even on a stranger. She had heard enough about what went on in the territories still, about the injustices that traveled with men in this country like shadows. Dr. Pratt arrived at mid-morning, rode his old gray mare right into the yard with his black bag hanging from the saddle horn. He was a small, precise man with wire spectacles and gray side whiskers, and he examined the stranger with careful thoroughness, pressing and prodding and listening through his stethoscope, and finally stood back and looked at Harriet over the rims of his glasses. "Bullet went clean through," he said, "which is a mercy. The infection is the problem. He's got a fever that's been building for at least 2-3 days. Whoever he is, he's been riding with this wound untended for longer than he should have been able to." "Will he live?" Harriet asked. Dr. Pratt considered this with the same careful honesty he brought to everything. "If the fever breaks in the next day or two, yes. If it climbs another degree or two and doesn't come back down, probably not. Keep him cool. Keep water in him. Change the dressing every 4 hours." He handed her a small brown bottle. "Laudanum if the pain gets bad enough that he can't rest. Rest is what will save him if anything does." He did not ask her who the man was. He had lived in this county long enough to know that sometimes people arrived and sometimes questions about their arrival were better left for later. He charged her 60 cents for the visit and the medicine, which she paid from the tin on the kitchen shelf, and he rode away back toward Millhaven and left her with her stranger. She spent the next 36 hours in that side room and at the kitchen stove and back again. She slept in the chair beside the cot for perhaps 3 hours total, waking each time he moved or made a sound. The fever rose through the first afternoon and into the night, and she sponged his face and his neck and his chest with cool water and spoke to him in a steady, calm voice the way she had once spoken to a laboring mare, just sound and steadiness, a human presence in the dark to keep the frightened animal from giving up. He was a large man, long in the legs and broad through the chest, and the cot was small, but he lay still enough once the fever was truly gripping him, still and soaked with sweat, his breathing rough but rhythmic. She looked at his face for a long time in those hours. The old scar on his cheek caught the lantern light and threw a thin shadow. She wondered who had given it to him and whether he had deserved it or not. She supposed she would not know until he could talk. The fever broke sometime before dawn on the second morning. She knew it before she was fully awake. The sound of his breathing changed, deepened, smoothed out, and when she pressed her hand to his forehead, the fire was gone, and what remained was just ordinary skin, damp and cool, the skin of a man who had come through something and was now on the other side of it. She was so relieved that she sat back in the chair and pressed both hands over her mouth and breathed carefully through her nose for a full minute. She was not given to sentimentality about strangers. She told herself that it was simply that she did not want to have a dead man on her property, which was not an entirely untrue statement, but it was not the whole truth either. He slept through the morning. She did her chores, fed the horses, milked the 2 cows, gathered eggs, split wood, started a pot of beans on the stove, and checked on him twice. Both times he was sleeping deeply and genuinely, not the thrashing half-death of the fever, but real sleep. In the early afternoon, she came in with a bowl of broth and found his eyes open. They were gray. She had not expected gray. They were a clear, serious gray, and they found her immediately when she came through the door, and they watched her with an alertness that surprised her, given the state he had been in. "You're awake," she said, because there was nothing more useful to say. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was rough and low, scoured down by fever and disuse, but it was steady. He tried to sit up, got about 4 inches off the cot, and abandoned the effort with a controlled exhale. "Don't," Harriet said. "You'll open the wound." She set the bowl on the small shelf beside the cot and settled into the chair. "You've been here 2 nights. You had a very bad fever. The infection is still in there, but the worst has passed, according to Dr. Pratt." He absorbed this information quietly. He looked at the ceiling, then at his own hands resting on the blanket she had laid over him, then back at her. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For falling through your barn door." A pause. "And whatever else I may have done that I can't presently recall." "That was the extent of it," Harriet said. "Can you tell me your name?" A slight hesitation. Not a dishonest one, she thought, more like a man who had been asked a question he had not had to answer in a while. "Frederick Hadley." "Harriet Shelton," she said. "This is my farm. You're in the feed room of my barn." "Yes, ma'am, I'd gathered." He paused again. "I'd be grateful for some water." She gave him water first, then broth, and she had to help him hold the cup because his hands were not steady enough on their own. He accepted this without comment, without embarrassment, which she noted. Some men, most men she had encountered, truly, would have made a considerable production out of being helped to drink by a woman they had just met. Frederick Hadley simply drank the water with careful, deliberate sips and thanked her quietly when the cup was empty. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Missouri, originally. Haven't been back in some years." "Where were you going?" He looked at the ceiling again. "West," he said, which was not really an answer but which told her something all the same. West was what people said when they did not have a specific destination, when they were moving away from something rather than toward something, when the direction mattered more than the arrival. "The bullet," she said. "I won't ask who shot you, but I'll ask whether whoever shot you is likely to come looking." His gray eyes came back to her with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "No," he said. "It was a disagreement that settled itself before it could follow me. I want no more trouble than I've already brought to your door." She nodded. She believed him. It was not a naive belief. She looked at him carefully when she said it, watched his face, and found nothing that suggested a lie. She had looked at men's faces for 31 years, and she was not easily fooled. "All right," she said. "You'll stay until you're well enough to ride. Your horse is fine. I've been feeding him." Frederick Hadley closed his eyes. "Thank you," he said, and it came out with a weight to it that suggested it was not a phrase he used carelessly. "I mean that sincerely." "I know you do," she said, and got up to take the empty bowl back to the kitchen. He was on his feet unsteadily, leaning against the door frame of the feed room by the fourth morning. She found him standing in the barn proper, just standing and looking at the big roan gelding in the stall, his hand pressed flat to the animal's nose, and she stood in the barn door for a moment before he heard her and turned around. He looked, standing up, like exactly what he was, a man who had been cut down to his last resources and was just beginning to rebuild them. He was thinner than he should have been, pale beneath the weathering of his skin, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who knew that the pain was waiting for him if he forgot himself. But he was standing. His eyes were clear. "You should be resting," she said. "I've been lying flat for 4 days," he said. "I needed to see about my horse." She could not argue with that. A man's horse was a serious matter in 1873 Kansas. It was the difference between getting where you were going and not. "His name is August," Frederick said. "I've had him 6 years. He's a good horse," Harriet said. "He found my barn on his own, more or less. I think he knew you needed help." Frederick looked at the gelding for a long moment with an expression that was so unguarded she felt slightly as though she were intruding on something private. Then he cleared his throat and turned back toward the feed room. "I'll get back to resting," he said. She made him proper food that evening. Not just broth but cornbread and beans, and a piece of the smoked ham she had been saving. And she carried it out to the barn because he had insisted on sleeping there rather than in the house, which she respected as the correct sort of insistence from a man with any decency. She sat on an upturned bucket while he ate and they talked, or something that was beginning to approach talking, which was to say they exchanged information in a careful, unhurried way, testing the water before wading in. She told him about the farm Thomas's death 3 years back, the mortgage that had frightened her badly for the first 2 years, and that she had reduced to a manageable thing through stubbornness and careful management. She told him about the wheat and the cattle, and the fact that she needed to hire a hand for the harvest season. but that the last 3 men she had hired had been either unreliable or presumptuous in ways that had made her tired. He told her about Missouri, about a father who had farmed, and a mother who had died young, and 3 brothers who had scattered in different directions after the war. He had been 18 when the war started and he had served, and he said this plainly and without embellishment, and she did not press for details because she had known men who had served, and she understood that the details had a way of being heavier than the telling of them was worth. After the war, he said, he had drifted. Worked cattle drives up from Texas to Abilene, worked as a ranch hand in Colorado, done a season of buffalo hunting with a crew out of Dodge City, which he said with a distaste that she found interesting, and then worked for a time for a surveying crew mapping federal land in the territories. The surveying had ended badly, he said, and when she raised an eyebrow he explained, with a careful flatness that she recognized as the tone of a man speaking about something that still sat wrong with him, that the survey crew had been marking land that belonged to Osage people who had every right to it and had been told they would keep it, and that he had walked away from the job when he understood what he was part of, and that his employer had taken this personally. "The man who shot you?" Harriet asked. "The man who sent the man who shot me," Frederick said. "He's a land speculator out of Topeka, very successful man, very connected." He paused. "The kind of man who doesn't come personally to settle arguments." She looked at him steadily. "You knew the land wasn't rightfully being taken and you walked away." "I walked away," he said. "I'm not looking for a medal for it. I should have seen it sooner." "Most men wouldn't have walked away at all," she said. He looked at her with those clear gray eyes. "Most men don't have to sleep at night," he said, and it was the most he had said about himself in one sentence, and she felt the weight of it settle into the room. He was strong enough to do light work by the end of the first week. She found him on the 8th morning cleaning out stalls with a pitchfork, moving slowly and resting frequently, but doing the work correctly. She stood in the barn door and watched him for a moment. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said without stopping. "I want to earn my keep." She did not argue with that either. The weather turned cold at the end of the second week, the kind of cold that came down off the plains like a judgment, sudden and certain, and Frederick's wound was healing well, but he had developed a cough that Dr. Pratt, on his second visit, said was a concern. Not dangerous yet, but the kind of cough that could become dangerous if he was back on the road in the cold before it cleared. She relayed this information to Frederick while he was sitting on the edge of the cot with his shirt off so she could change his dressing, and he was quiet for a long moment. "I don't want to be a burden," he said. "You split 4 cords of firewood yesterday," she said, working carefully at the clean wound, which was healing from the inside out the way it should. "You're not a burden." Another silence. She could feel him thinking. "I could work," he said slowly. "A proper arrangement, earn my board through the winter. You said you needed a hand for the harvest, and the harvest isn't finished yet. I saw your south field still has wheat standing." She did not look up from the dressing. "The last hand I hired was inappropriate," she said carefully. "I understand that," Frederick said, "and I won't be. I have no interest in being anything but what I say I am." She tied off the bandage and stepped back and looked at him directly. He met her eyes without flinching or posturing, with the same even steadiness that she had come to recognize as simply the way he was, a man who did not look away from things. "Through the winter," she said. "The cough clears, the work is good, and we'll revisit in spring." "That's fair," he said. He put his shirt back on carefully, favoring the left side. "There's a proper room in the house," she said. "The barn's going to be too cold." He looked at her. She looked at him. This was a significant offer, and they both knew it. "The Morse family down the road," Harriet said, with the particular calmness of a woman who had decided something and was not interested in defending it, "mind their own business. And I have been a grown woman, managing my own affairs for long enough that I do not require the county's opinion on my household arrangements." The corner of Frederick's mouth moved in what was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. It changed his face considerably, softened it, opened it, made the scar seem like a crease in a well-used map rather than a wound. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She moved him into Thomas's old room at the back of the house. She had stripped that room clean 2 years ago, removed all of Thomas's things with the same efficient grief with which she did everything, and it was a bare, practical room with a good mattress and a south-facing window, and she had put fresh sheets on the bed and left a second quilt on the chair. Frederick looked at the room without comment, set down the small saddlebag that was the entirety of his possessions, and thanked her. The cough cleared in 3 weeks. By then he had harvested the south wheat field, repaired the fence along the east pasture, replaced 2 boards in the barn floor that had been rotted through, and shot a deer that had been raiding her kitchen garden, which they dressed and salted and hung, and which would provide meat through a significant portion of the winter. He was thorough and quiet, and he worked hard, and he did not make assumptions about what she wanted done but asked, clearly and specifically, before he began a new task. She found this to be an extraordinary quality in a man. The evenings were where things shifted, almost without her noticing. They fell into the habit of sitting at the kitchen table after supper, she with her mending, he with whatever task his hands found, sharpening tools or repairing harness, or simply sitting with his coffee and talking. The talking was slow at first, careful and informational, the kind of conversation that people have when they are learning each other's geography. But it deepened, gradually, the way rivers deepen the further from their source you traveled. He told her about the buffalo hunting with a genuine revulsion that she respected, about the waste of it, the absolute staggering, incomprehensible waste of thousands of animals killed for their hides and left on the plain to rot, and the way it had changed the land and the people whose lives had been built around those animals for generations. He said these things with a quiet fury that he kept carefully controlled, the fury of a man who had been part of something he could not undo and carried the knowledge of it. She told him about Thomas, not the grief, which was private and mostly resolved, but the man himself. Thomas had been a good man, she said, a reliable man, but he had been constitutionally unable to plan further ahead than the next season, and the farm had been in a state of constant, barely managed chaos for the 11 years of their marriage, and she had spent the 3 years since his death methodically putting things in order and discovering, with a surprise that had felt uncomfortably like relief, that she was quite good at it. "You're very good at it," Frederick said. She looked up from her mending. He was looking at her with a directness that she felt in her sternum. "I know," she said, and he smiled, a real one this time, not just the corner of his mouth, a genuine, uncomplicated smile that came from somewhere honest, and Harriet Shelton looked at that smile and felt something happen in her chest that she chose, carefully, not to examine too closely just yet. November arrived hard and cold and white. The first snow came early, a real one, 6 inches overnight, and they worked together in the cold to make sure the animals were all right, moving in the barn together with the ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms without discussing it. He handed her things before she asked for them. She moved out of his way before he had to say, "Excuse me." They did not touch, except accidentally and briefly, but the not touching had begun to take on its own weight. She caught herself watching him when he did not know she was watching. She caught herself listening for his footsteps on the porch in the mornings. She caught herself constructing small excuses to be in whatever room he happened to be working in. She was 31 years old, and she had been married for 11 years and widowed for 3, and she was not a fool about herself or about feelings, and she recognized what was happening with the same clear-eyed practicality she brought to everything. She was falling in love with him. She did not tell him this. She turned it over in her mind in the evenings when she was alone and looked at it from all sides. He was a drifter, technically, a man without permanent attachment to any place or person, a man who had spent 15 years in motion. The plan had been that he would leave in spring. She was not a woman who built things on uncertain foundations. But she watched him with the horses, and she watched him with the land, The way he looked at her land as though he saw it, really saw it, the particular quality of it, the slight rise to the south where the soil was better, and the slight hollow to the north where it held moisture well. And she thought about what it meant for a drifting man to look at land that way. He caught her watching him one evening in November. She had brought coffee out to the barn where he was doing something to one of the harnesses, and she was standing in the doorway, and he turned and found her looking, and did not look away from her looking. They held each other's gaze for 3, 4, 5 seconds, and then he said quietly, "The coffee going to walk itself over here." She crossed the barn and handed him the mug, and their fingers brushed, and neither of them moved for just a moment, both holding the mug between them in the cold air of the barn, and then she let go. "Thank you," he said. His voice was different, lower, more careful. "Of course," she said, and went back to the house, and stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table and breathed. The conversation that changed everything happened in the second week of December, during a storm that had kept them both inside all day. The snow had been driving sideways since morning, and the windows were white with it, and the house was small and warm and full of the smell of the venison stew she had had on the stove since noon. They had been in the same room most of the day, she at the table with her accounts book, he at the other end with a cracked saddle he was stitching, and the comfortable silence between them had stretched and deepened into something richer than just quiet. She had been looking at the numbers in the accounts book for 20 minutes without seeing them. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked up. "Yes." She put her pen down. She looked at him. "When spring comes," she said, "what are you going to do?" He was quiet for a long moment. He set down the saddle and the awl and looked at her with that even serious look. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "So have I," she said. Another silence. The wind drove snow against the window, and the fire in the stove made its small sounds, and the house felt very small and very warm. "I don't have anything to offer you," he said. It came out careful and honest. A man who was not going to dress up the truth for the sake of sounding better than he was. "I've got August, and what's in that saddlebag, and whatever I've earned here these past months. I'm a man who hasn't stayed in one place since I was 18 years old." "I know all of that," Harriet said. "I'm not the kind of man that a sensible woman builds a future on," he said. "You've been here 3 months," she said, "and in 3 months you have been the most reliable, honest, and decent person to set foot on this land since before Thomas died, possibly since before Thomas arrived." She said this plainly, not as a confession, just as a fact. "I'm a sensible woman. I'm telling you what I see." Frederick Hadley looked at her for a long time in the firelight. The scar on his cheek was in shadow, and his gray eyes were very serious, and there was something on his face that she could only describe as the expression of a man who has been given something he had stopped expecting to receive. "Harriet," he said. "Yes. I'm not riding on in the spring." She let out a breath she had been holding, apparently, for quite some time. "Good," she said. "That's settled, then." He smiled, and it was the best smile she had yet seen from him, full and real and startled by itself, the smile of a man who had been found when he had given up on being found. "Just like that?" he asked. "Just like that," she said. "Though I will say, and I am saying this because I am always honest about what I mean, when I say I don't want you to ride on, I mean it in every way there is to mean it." He got up from his chair and crossed the kitchen and stood at the other end of the table from her. He looked down at her with those gray eyes. "I mean it that way, too," he said. "I should tell you that I have meant it that way for some time now, and I have been trying very hard to be decent about it." "You've been very decent about it," Harriet said. "Perhaps too decent." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. His hands were large and scarred and warm, and he held it with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the size of them and the history written on them, but was not at odds with him. "I want to do this right," he said, "if you'll let me." "I've been a widow 3 years," Harriet said. "You don't need to court me like a girl, but yes, do it right." He did. He did it with a seriousness and a care that she found genuinely moving. He brought her things, small, specific things that showed he had been paying attention. A bunch of dried sage from the south hillside where she had mentioned, in passing, that she liked the smell. a piece of quartz he had turned up while repairing the fence, pale and perfect, that she had admired for half a moment before he pocketed it, and which appeared on the kitchen windowsill one morning. He asked her about her life, not the surface of it but the middle of it, what she had wanted when she was young, what she had thought about in the long Kansas dark of her married years, what she loved about this land and this life, and what she had made of it. He told her about himself more fully than he had before. About the war, about the things he had seen that had changed the shape of the world for him permanently, about the brother he had lost at Gettysburg, and the other two brothers he had not spoken to in years, because the silence had simply accumulated until it was a wall, and about the particular loneliness of moving from place to place for 15 years, carrying your whole life in a saddlebag, knowing everyone slightly and no one well, sleeping in bunkhouses and under stars and in rooms rented by the week where you left no mark. "I'd stopped thinking I wanted anything different," he said, one evening in January when the cold was at its worst and they were sitting close to the stove. "I'd made a kind of peace with it. You can talk yourself into just about anything if you give it enough time." "What changed?" she asked, though she knew the answer. He looked at her and did not say anything for a moment, and then he said, "I fell through your barn door." She laughed. It came out freely, a real laugh, and it surprised her because she had not laughed freely in longer than she could clearly remember. Frederick watched her laugh with an expression of such naked pleasure that she had to look away for a moment to collect herself. "I suppose that is one way to begin a thing," she said. "It's my way," he said. "I've never done anything the straightforward way." She reached over and took his hand, which was the first time she had reached for him instead of waiting, and he turned his hand over and threaded his fingers through hers, and they sat like that for a long time, watching the fire, while the January wind moved across the flat plains outside and the house was warm and still. He kissed her for the first time in February, on a clear cold morning when they had been checking the ice on the water trough together, and the sun was brilliant on the snow, and she had turned to say something to him, and found him looking at her with an expression so transparent that she simply stopped talking. He took her face in both hands carefully, the way he handled everything he did not want to damage, and he kissed her slowly and with his whole attention. She kissed him back with the same completeness, her hands fisting in the front of his coat. When they separated, they stood in the bright cold morning looking at each other, and she was aware that her heart was doing something dramatic that she approved of entirely. "I should have done that some time ago," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You should have." He kissed her again, and this one was less careful and more honest, and the snow came down off the eaves in a small brief waterfall, and neither of them noticed. There was a complication in March. There was always a complication, she had learned. Life organized its difficulties with a reliable consistency. The complication came in the form of a man named Elmore Gaines, who arrived at her property on a Tuesday morning on a fine black horse with a letter of introduction and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He was 40-something, broad through the middle, well-dressed by frontier standards, with a ring on each hand and the manner of a man who was accustomed to conversations going his way. He introduced himself as a land agent from Topeka. Harriet recognized the type before he finished introducing himself. She had met land agents before. They came to widows' farms the way buzzards came to anything that was no longer being vigorously defended. He wanted to buy her farm. He made the offer in the tone of someone doing her a great favor. It was not a fair price, it was perhaps 60% of what the land was worth, though he dressed it up in language that was meant to obscure this. He mentioned, carefully, the hardship of a woman managing a property alone. He mentioned the terrible winter. He mentioned that the market for Kansas wheat was uncertain. Harriet let him finish and then said, "No." Gaines looked at her with the look of a man who had not expected that answer in that tone. "Mrs. Shelton," he began. "My answer is no," she said. "My land is not for sale. I'll ask you to leave now." Gaines' eyes moved just briefly to Frederick, who had appeared from the direction of the barn at some point during the conversation, and was now standing about 20 feet away, not saying anything, just standing. He was leaning against the fence post with his arms crossed and his hat pulled forward against the winter sun, and he was not doing anything threatening at all. He was simply there, solid and present and entirely unmoved. Gaines looked back at Harriet. He smiled the smile that did not touch his eyes. "I'll be back," he said. "These things have a way of becoming more compelling over time." "I doubt you'll find it so," Harriet said, and held his gaze until he turned his horse and rode away down the road. When he was out of sight, Frederick walked over. He stopped beside her and they both watched the cloud of dust the black horse left on the road. "Topeka land agent," she said, "not the first one." "Did he give you a name?" Frederick asked. His voice was very even. "Elmer Gaines." A pause. "I don't know him personally," Frederick said, "but I know the type he works for." A longer pause. "Do you want me to do anything about it?" "Not yet," she said. "He may decide it's not worth his time. These men usually move on to softer targets when they find resistance." She looked up at Frederick. "But I'm glad you were here." He looked down at her. "I'll always be here," he said, and it was the simplest statement, said with the simplest honesty, and it landed in her chest with more weight than a declaration 3 times as elaborate. Gaines came back in April, and this time he brought a deputy sheriff from the county seat named Amos Pruitt, who Harriet suspected had been generously persuaded to make the trip. Pruitt had a piece of paper that he described as a tax assessment, and that claimed she owed back taxes on the property in an amount that was just large enough to be threatening. Harriet, who kept her accounts with meticulous care, looked at the paper and looked at Pruitt and said, "This figure is incorrect. I have documentation of every tax payment I've made on this land for 6 years. Come in and I'll show you." She showed him. She showed him the receipt book that she kept in the tin box on the kitchen shelf, every payment dated and itemized in her own precise handwriting, every receipt from the county office clipped neatly to the corresponding page. Pruitt looked at the receipts and looked at the paper in his hand, and had the grace to look embarrassed. Gaines, standing in the kitchen doorway, did not look embarrassed at all, but his smile was different now, thinner, tighter. "There appears to have been an administrative error," Pruitt said carefully. "Yes," Harriet said, "there does." When they were gone, she sat down at the kitchen table and let herself be still for a moment. Frederick was in the doorway. He had made himself scarce during the legal discussion, which she had handled entirely herself, but he had been in earshot. "He's going to try something else," Frederick said. "Probably," she said. "He's the stubborn kind." "I want to tell you something," Frederick said, coming into the kitchen and sitting across from her. He looked serious. "When I left the surveying crew, the man who runs that crew, his name is Harlan Webb. Webb has connections all through western Kansas and into the territories. He supplies people like Gaines with legal cover. I don't know for certain that Webb is behind this, but the method is the same." She looked at him steadily. "You think this may be connected to you being here?" "I think it may be," he said, "and I think you should know that." "If it is," Harriet said, "it doesn't change anything." "It could bring more trouble to your door," he said. "Frederick," she said, "I am a woman who found a half-dead stranger in her barn and nursed him back to health and let him into her home and has been falling in love with him since approximately November. If Harlan Webb and Elmer Gaines were going to frighten me off that decision, they would have had to arrive considerably earlier." Frederick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I love you, Harriet." He said it the way he did everything, directly, without decoration, with his whole honest weight behind it. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the April morning light. The sun came through the window and lay across the table between them, warm and plain, the ordinary sun of an ordinary morning on the Kansas plain. "I love you too," she said. "I've been waiting for you to say that for quite some time. I wanted to be sure I was staying before I said it." "And are you sure?" "More sure than I've been of anything in 15 years, he said. She got up from the table, walked around it, and took his face in her hands the way he had taken hers, and she kissed him in the kitchen in the April sunlight, and the chickens outside made their small indifferent sounds, and the horses moved in the barn, and everything was completely ordinary and completely extraordinary at the same time. The matter of Gaines was resolved, ultimately, not by confrontation but by light. Harriet wrote a letter to the county recorder's office in the county seat, outlining the attempted intimidation and the false tax assessment, and she wrote a second letter to the state land office in Topeka, and she wrote a third letter to the editor of the Millhaven Courier, who was a man named George Beaumont, and who did not care for land speculators on principle. George Beaumont published the story, carefully documented, in May. By June, there were 2 other farmers in the county who had been similarly approached by Gaines and who were willing to say so publicly. The connection to Harlan Webb was not definitively proven, but Webb's name appeared in the paper in connection with certain surveying irregularities in the territory that were also coming to light, and by the end of that summer Gaines had moved his operations to a different county, and Harriet Shelton's farm was left in peace. "You handled that beautifully," Frederick told her. "Letters are more powerful than most men think," she said. He laughed. She had made him laugh more in 8 months than he had laughed in the previous 8 years, or so he told her, and she believed him, because she had watched the thing happen, the slow unlocking of him, the gradual opening of a man who had been shut tight against the world and who was discovering, cautiously and with wonder, that the world had something good in it after all. He proposed to her in June, the proper way, which meant he asked her sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the windows open to the warm evening and the sound of the grasshoppers in the grass outside, and he had a ring, a small and simple thing, a slim gold band that he had ridden to Millhaven to buy from the jeweler there, a trip that she understood in retrospect had been why he had been gone all day on that particular Tuesday. He said, "I know I came to you with nothing. I know I'm still not a man of means, but I am a man who intends to spend the rest of his life on this land with you, building something that is worth having, if you'll have me." She looked at the ring and looked at him and said, "Frederick Hadley, I have been waiting for you to ask me that since at least January." "Why didn't you ask me?" he said. "Because it wouldn't have meant as much if I had," she said, which made him laugh again, and then she held out her hand and he slid the ring on her finger and then he did not let go of her hand. They were married in August, at the small white church in Millhaven. Dr. Pratt stood up for Frederick, which was appropriate since he had been the one to give him a fighting chance at life, and Harriet's neighbor Margaret Moore stood up for Harriet, and the congregation was small but the afternoon was beautiful. The Kansas sky that particular blue that it only achieved in late summer, enormous and clear, and when the pastor said his words and Frederick said his words, he said them looking directly at Harriet with those serious gray eyes that she had watched change from fever-clouded to clear to careful to warm across the months of their knowing each other. She said her words back looking at him with the same directness and the same full honesty. This woman who had managed her own life and her own grief and her own land for 3 years. This woman who had leveled a shotgun at a dark barn door and then knelt in the straw beside a stranger, who had held a stranger's head while he drank water and held a stranger's hand through a fever, and who had somewhere in those weeks and months stopped thinking of him as a stranger at all. After the wedding they rode home to the farm in the late afternoon light, the horses moving at an easy pace, the roan August keeping even with Harriet's bay mare, Frederick riding with his hat pushed back and his face open and easy in a way that people who had only known him before the previous October would not have recognized, and Harriet riding beside him with her hands light on the reins and the late sun catching the gold band on her finger. Their first winter as a married couple was the winter she later told people had been her favorite of all of them, though she could not entirely explain why, because it was cold and difficult in all the ways that Kansas winters were cold and difficult. But there was something about the winter of 1874 that she would always think of with a warmth that had nothing to do with weather. They were completely new to each other in some ways and completely known to each other in others, and the combination of those two things created a kind of tenderness that was unlike anything she had experienced before, something that was both the excitement of discovery and the safety of familiarity, braided together. He was different with her, and she knew it and was moved by it. Not different in the sense of performing a different version of himself, but different in the sense of more open, more present, more willing to let her see the soft places in him that a man spent most of his life protecting. He woke sometimes in the night from dreams that she understood without being told, were from the war, and she would feel him go still and breathe carefully beside her, and she would put her hand on his chest without saying anything, and after a time his breathing would even out, and he would put his hand over hers, and they would both sleep. She was different with him, too. She was less alone in the way that she had been alone for so long that she had forgotten it was a form of suffering. She had not understood how much of her daily life she had been doing, in a kind of isolation that she had chosen not to examine, because examining it would not have helped. Now there was someone to hand her the right tool in the barn, and someone to sit across from at breakfast, and someone whose particular weight in the bed beside her was the most comprehensively reassuring thing she had ever known. By the following spring, the farm was producing better than it had in years. They had extended the fence along the north pasture and added 6 cattle to the existing herd. Frederick had been building, steadily through the fall and winter, a reputation in the county as a reliable, honest man who knew cattle and land, and who could be hired for fair survey work, the kind that actually reflected what the land was, and he had begun to take jobs of that kind in the surrounding counties, which brought in enough additional income that Harriet was able to pay off the last of the mortgage on the farm in May of 1875, and she folded the final receipt and put it in the tin box and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand on the box, and felt the full weight of what she had done, what she had built and held and protected. And then she went out to find Frederick. He was in the south field. She walked out to him across the newly greened land in the May morning, and when she reached him she held up the receipt without saying anything, and he read it and looked at her, and she watched something happen in his face that she recognized as the expression of a man who was moved by something and was not going to pretend he wasn't. He put his arms around her right there in the south field with the wheat coming up green and the Kansas sky vast and blue overhead, and she pressed her face into the side of his neck and held on, and he held her, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. She was with child by that autumn. She told him on a September evening while they were doing the evening chores together, moving through the barn in the companionable rhythm they had developed, and she told him plainly, the way she told him everything, and then she watched his face. He turned to look at her, and he was completely still for a long moment, and she could see him integrating the information, the way he always did with important things, giving it the full weight of his attention. Then he crossed the barn and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and her cheeks and then her mouth, and when he stepped back his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen from him before. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I'm well," she said. "Strong, the same." "Good," he said. He took a breath. "Good." He looked at her with an expression of such profound happiness that she felt it in her own chest like a struck bell. "Harriet," he said. "I know," she said. "I just want to say I know what you've built here. I know this is your land and your home and everything you've made. I want you to know that I understand that and that, Frederick," she said. "Stop explaining yourself and come to supper." He laughed, startled and full, and took her hand, and they walked out of the barn together into the September dark, and the stars were coming up over the flat plain, and August moved quietly in his stall, and the farm lay around them in the dark, solid and real and entirely theirs. The baby came in April, which the doctor said was right on schedule. Dr. Pratt delivered him, a boy. A solid, vocally enthusiastic boy on an April morning, while Frederick paced the kitchen below with a precision that wore a path in the floorboards. When Pratt called him up and he came into the room, and Harriet held up the baby wrapped in the flannel she had prepared, she watched Frederick see his son for the first time. He sat down on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the baby for a long moment without touching, taking it all in. And then he held out one large, scarred hand and the baby's fist wrapped around his finger. And Frederick Hadley, who had been a drifting man for 15 years, who had crossed the war and the plains and the territories and the particular emptiness of a life, lived without a place to land, put his free hand over his mouth and breathed very carefully through his nose for a full minute. "Hello," he said to the baby quietly. "I've been looking for you for a while." Harriet watched this with the full, overflowing happiness of a woman who had built her life correctly and knew it. "What shall we name him?" she asked. Frederick looked up at her. "What do you want?" She had thought about it. "Thomas," she said. "For his grandfather on my side." A pause. "If that's all right." Frederick nodded. "Thomas Hadley," he said. He tried the name out again quietly. "Yes, that's right." Young Thomas Hadley announced his presence in the county of a morning, and continued to announce it reliably for the subsequent months, a fact that Harriet and Frederick navigated together with the same practical competence they brought to everything, taking turns at the night wakings, consulting Dr. Pratt with appropriate but not excessive frequency, and discovering together the particular exhausted joy of new parenthood, which was nothing like either of them had expected and better than both of them had hoped. Frederick was, she discovered, a naturally good father. He was patient with a depth that she found striking in a man whose own life had given him so little that was soft. He would sit with Thomas for long stretches, talking to him in a low, unhurried voice, describing what he could see out the window, the horses in the yard, the progress of the wheat in the south field, the particular quality of the light on a late afternoon. Thomas would watch his father's face with enormous, focused eyes, and Harriet would watch from the doorway and feel the uncomplicated, brilliant gladness of a woman who had made exactly the right choices. The seasons turned. Thomas grew. The farm flourished. Frederick's surveying reputation grew also, and he was careful about which work he took, which was something Harriet loved about him. The fact that his reputation for fairness meant that the people who hired him knew what they were getting and valued it, and the people who wanted something else eventually stopped asking. He came home from every survey trip the way he came home from every barn or field task, without fanfare, without drama, and found her wherever she was and said he was home. He always said it simply, "I'm home." Not "I'm back" or "I've returned," but "I'm home." And she heard the weight in it every time, the ongoing wonder of it, from a man who had not had a home for the better part of his adult life. She always said, "Welcome home," and she meant it completely. Thomas was 2 years old when she discovered she was expecting again, and this time she told Frederick at breakfast, setting the coffee down in front of him and then sitting across from him and saying, "It's happened again," and watching him look up from his cup with that same careful, integrating attention and then smile. "When?" he asked. "Late winter, Dr. Pratt thinks, February." Frederick reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you pleased?" "Very," she said. "Are you?" "Very," he said. The second child was a girl, which surprised them both in the specific way that a thing surprises you when you had thought you expected it but discover you had not truly until it arrived. She was smaller than Thomas had been and louder, immediately and without apology, and she had Frederick's gray eyes, which Harriet noticed within the first hour and which moved her in a way she did not try to explain or contain. They named her Clara, after Harriet's mother who had died young, and she turned out to have her mother's determination and her father's steadiness, a combination that manifested, in a small child, as an almost comical certainty about what she wanted and a complete willingness to wait, with perfect patience, until she got it. Thomas, at 2, regarded his sister with the wary diplomacy of a small person who understood that the social landscape had fundamentally shifted. Within 3 months he had decided she was acceptable company, and within 6 he was fiercely protective of her in the way of small boys who have been taught, by example, that protection was something you gave without being asked. Frederick watched this development with a quiet pride that Harriet knew he would never name out loud because he was constitutionally unable to make a fuss about himself. She made the fuss for him occasionally, just enough, just the right amount. She had learned the right amount. They had a life, complete and warm and full, rooted in the particular soil of the Kansas plain, surrounded by the particular quality of Kansas light. They had a farm that was theirs outright in cattle and horses, and a barn that no longer had a rotted floorboard anywhere, and a south field that produced well, and neighbors they trusted, and a doctor 12 miles away, who had seen them through more than one crisis, and who came to dinner on occasion, and said, every time he came, looking at the family around the table, that some things in this difficult life turned out exactly as they should. There was an evening, 4 years after Frederick had fallen through the barn door, when Harriet was sitting on the porch in the late summer dark, watching the stars, and she heard the door behind her and the creak of the porch board that had a particular sound, and then Frederick sat down beside her on the bench. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the house was quiet behind them with the children asleep, and the plain was dark and wide and full of the sounds of late summer insects, and the stars above were the same stars she had looked up at on the night she had crossed the yard in bare feet toward the barn. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked. "About what?" "The night you arrived." He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said. "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "I think about picking up the shotgun. I think about the sound you made when I found you." "What sound?" "Like something trying not to give up," she said. He held her a little tighter. "That's about right," he said. "I think about the moment I decided to help you," she said, "and how it was not really a decision, it was just what was going to happen." "I know," he said. "I've thought about that too. The version of that night where you walked back to the house and left me in the barn. That's a version I don't like to think about too long." "I couldn't have done it," she said. "I tried to think about whether I could have done it, and I couldn't." "I know," he said again. He pressed his lips to her temple. "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me." "The north pasture," he said. "I want to put winter wheat in the north pasture this year. The moisture retention there, I think it could do well." She laughed, sudden and soft in the dark. "You've been thinking about the north pasture, among other things." She turned her head and kissed him, there on the porch in the August dark, and he kissed her back the way he always kissed her, with his whole careful, serious attention, like it was still new, like it was something he did not take for granted. It had been, she thought, a rather extraordinary turn of events. A man had fallen through her barn door half dead, and she had saved him, and he had never found a reason to ride on, and that was the whole story and the right story and the only story she could now imagine having lived. In the spring of 1878, they planted the north pasture with winter wheat, and it grew well, better than the south field by a small but meaningful margin, and Frederick walked the rows of it in the late afternoon while Thomas toddled at his heels, and Clara rode on his back with her small fists twisted in his collar, and Harriet watched from the edge of the field with her hand shading her eyes against the western sun. He caught her watching and called out, "Come here." She walked out into the field to him. The wheat was up around their boots and the sky was doing its elaborate best in every direction, the way the Kansas sky did when the conditions were right, and he had Clara on one arm and Thomas's hand in his other, and he looked at her over their heads with those gray eyes that she knew better than she knew anything else. "Good year," he said. "Good year," she agreed. "Good life," he said. She looked at him for a moment, at this man with his old scars and his quiet voice and his hands that were always warm, this man who had arrived at her barn door with nothing and who was standing in her wheat field now with everything that mattered, and she felt the complete, unambiguous rightness of it, the way a thing that has grown organically and correctly from its beginning has a quality of inevitability to it, not that it could not have gone otherwise, but that it went this way. And this way was the right way. "Good life," she said. Thomas reached up and took her hand, and Clara leaned from Frederick's arm toward her and she took the baby, and they walked back across the field together in the late afternoon light, the four of them, the scarred drifter and the widow who had not left him in the barn, through the Kansas wheat, and toward the house where supper was already waiting, and the lamps would need lighting soon, and the porch would hold them both again later that night while the stars came out across the enormous dark. and everything that had needed finding had been found, and everything that needed building had been built, and every road Frederick Hadley had ever ridden had led, as it turned out, exactly here. He stopped at the edge of the field and looked back at the land for a moment, the way she had first seen him look at it from the barn stall, with that particular quality of attention, the attention of a man who was seeing something real and knowing it. "I want to tell you something," he said. She shifted Clara on her hip and looked at him. "When I was lying on that barn floor," he said, "I'd given up, not dramatically, just quietly. I'd been going a long time and I was tired, and I thought, well, this is probably the end of the road, and I didn't think there was much waiting on the other side of it worth the effort of getting there." He paused. "And then there was a light." "The lantern," she said. "The lantern," he agreed. "And your voice just steady like a human voice in the dark." He looked at her. "I held on to that. I held on to that all through the fever, just that sound, just the fact that there was somebody there." Harriet looked at him for a long moment, with everything that she felt for him fully present in her face, not hidden and not hedged, the full clear light of it. "I'll always be there," she said. "That's the arrangement." He nodded. "I know," he said. "I know it now." Thomas pulled at her hand, wanting to move, wanting supper, wanting to get back to the ordinary business of being alive, which was exactly right. They walked home. The farm stood in the evening light as it had stood before either of them had arrived at it, solid and plain and enduring, a house and a barn and 40 acres of the Kansas plain, ordinary as anything and extraordinary as everything, holding inside it all the things that two people could build when they decided, without fanfare or performance, simply to stay. The door closed behind them. The lamps came on, one by one, warm and yellow in the windows. Outside, August moved in his stall and the wheat stood in the fields, and the stars came up in their thousands over the flat Kansas dark. And everything was exactly as it should be, and would remain so, for a long and grateful while.